So right here, this is where it happened. So right here, this is where it happened. 1977. A young man bought a motorcycle. Had got himself a job working on the college farm in Bozeman, Montana, which is 300 miles that way. That young man also had a girlfriend in Miles City, Montana, and the plans were all set. We were going to go to college. Probably, you know, somewhere in the back of our minds was a future. So the young man, got on the motorcycle and came to visit over a weekend and stopped in my old hometown, Rosebud, Montana. Not much. It wasn't much back then either. But there's a building over there that is the new home of the Longhorn Bar. Of course, it's been the new home for 40 years. But in its place was a big old Western bar, burned down somewhere in the 60s, I think. It was owned by my grandfather. But that is the cultural center. You see, there's something different about these towns in the West. When this area was settled, the first thing that was built was a trading post which usually included a bar. And then the community grew up around it, and eventually maybe somebody built a church. Down south, where I now live in Arkansas, the Bible Belt, that was completely reversed. The church was built, the community grew around it, and then all the other things kind of added themselves to it. But I digress. Back to my story. This motorcycle brought that kid right here. And I stopped in, and lo and behold, there was a dance at the bar. So I hung out with my friends until the wee hours of the morning. And then we decided to go over to my buddy's house on the north side of the river here and crash, and I was going to go on to Miles City the next day. Being young, impetuous, and everybody was pouring out of the dance, we were going to show up. I've always been a show-off. That little section of street running across there is a corner. The railroad tracks are raised a little bit. I came up to that corner, turned it, caught 3 gears real quick, jumped those railroad tracks, and the throttle had stuck wide open on that motorcycle. And it hit the ground, squealed its tires, and went straight for that hillside. I had enough time to react momentarily, and that reaction was to step off the side. And the bike laid down and slid in a shower of sparks. And as I was sliding, I had time to think. I had time to look around. I was sliding on my butt. I looked down the road, and there's the lights of a car coming. And I'm wondering if I've got enough time to get across in front of that car. Well, the bike and I had parted company. And it hit somewhere along in here, tail first, and flipped and laid up on top of the hill. I slid across over here somewhere and flew and hit back first into that bank and rolled down into the ditch. Now the good Lord protects fools, idiots, and little children. And it just so happened that I had been running around all evening with my helmet on the sissy bar. And before I left to go out of town, I reached back and put it on. And I hit that bank hard enough to knock a chunk out of the back of that helmet. Well, I'm laying there trying to catch my breath, and my buddy comes along with his bike, and he's looking up where my motorcycle went, which is now idling on its side up there, and he's yelling, "Call it, call it, call it." And I'm trying to get enough air back in my lungs to say, "I'm over here." All of the activity and the commotion and the sparks and the headlight flashing as the bike did the somersault up the hill drawed the crowd that was coming out of the bar. By now I'm sitting up and I'm getting air back in me, and I'm going, I gotta go shut that thing off. And I tried to stand up and fell over. My leg wouldn't work. This was in the 70s, you know, the period of time of platform shoes. Remember those? Well, I had a pair on. And when I stepped off the side of that motorcycle, it ripped the shoe completely up one side and off my foot. Now my ankle is beginning to throb, and I know there's a problem. The gang that had gathered took me back over to the bar. Now this is, what, 2:30 in the morning? Sat me down on a bar stool, poured me a cup of coffee, put some whiskey in it, and we sat there yarning. I had lost a little patch of hide on my hip, had a little gone off my elbow, but other than my leg, I was unscathed. But we sat there and watched my foot swell up. You picked a fine time to leave me loose, wheel. Daylight come and, we were amongst friends. And they carried me to Miles City, 40 miles, to the doctor, who actually hated motorcycles, showed me absolutely no sympathy whatsoever. He told me that I was going to be in a cast for 6 months and crutches for a year, and I would probably end up having surgery on that ankle. I never made it to see my girlfriend. In fact, if memory serves me, I don't think I ever saw her again, because there was something else that transpired. 1977 was a bad year for grass. Now you can gather from what you see here, the color of those hillsides, that this year is bountiful. In 1977, things never turned green. Ranchers were in trouble. They were buying hay or selling cattle. I graduated in 76, and for the rest of that summer I worked at various ranches. And one of them was for a rancher named Dick Cheesem. Cheesem had developed his own registry of black baldy cattle. He did not have any hay land. He had rangeland. He was a cattleman. He didn't want to start buying hay, being creative like these old timers were. He figured out that there were trail drive laws that were still on the book, because as long as you had a destination, you could trail your cattle to that destination and gain right-of-way access along the route. He went to Saco, Montana, leased an acre of land for a day. Saco, Montana is near the Canadian border, about 400 miles that way. Then he gathered up his cattle and put his herd on the trail. By the time of the incident, by the time of the crash, by the time of my fortuitous escape from death, the cattle were up on the hill. A day or two later, after I had kind of recovered from the shock, I was hanging here in Rosebud. Where else am I going to go? The road's calling me. I got to wrap up this story and get on it. I was here doing nothing. I was sitting on a bar stool in the Longhorn Bar, drinking soda pop with my crutches leaned up, and into the bar walks Sherm Cheesem, and they are looking for riders to come and help push their herd through town. I had already told the college that I was going to need a week or two to kind of heal up before I could come back to work. But I'm sitting there at the bar stool, and I says, well, I suppose I could sit my butt in a saddle. So I went with them, and I got horseback, figured out that I could take a dolly around my cast, tie it to the saddle horn, and I could ride. I started helping bring the herd on down the road that way. To really understand this whole idea and this concept that old Dick Cheesem had come up with, I'll show you. See on the top of that hill, the fence? Most of the side roads, the back roads, most of the roads really in Montana are fenced. The long pasture that developed, as Dick called it, the long pasture with a hard spot in the middle, had grass. The cattle were working their way along the roadways, grazing on the grass on either side. The cattle would be penned up at night and then released again, and would make about 3 or 4 miles of grazing down the road, where they'd be watered and penned again at night. Riding along with them really involved horse sitting, amazing tourists, keeping the cattle moving along, so it was a meander. I decided to continue riding along with my foot in the cast, and I'm off on this little unexpected adventure. Now I am going to take you with me, and we're going to follow the path of this trail drive. I'll tell you what happens next. We've made it 10 miles up the road. Of course, at the watering hole. On the bike, it takes about 10 minutes. In a good fast car, less than that. But it took us 4 days with the cattle. And it is here. We brought these 600 head right downtown Forsyth. We're starting to get some attention, and that is going to matter here in a few days. And it is here. We brought these 600 head and coerced them across the Yellowstone Bridge. Now, I'm still going at this time. People are talking about the cattle drive and a man named Chisholm and the Chisholm Trail. Now, getting them cattle through town and across that bridge was no small feat. But we got across. Nothing lost. The trail continued that way. Well, I have been with them about a week now. My foot is stabilizing. Like I said, we're only going 3 miles a day, sitting horseback, pen up the cattle at night. So that meant we were only on the trail half a day, meaning the light half. The other half a day, the dark half. Town is right there. So me and the cowboys, right, impetuous youth, we had plenty of opportunity to do impetuous youth stuff. And I really wasn't quite ready to go back to Bozeman. So I decided we'll just stay on for a day or two.
One of the best things about the kind of work we do is the people we meet. Occasionally we'll get a pain in the neck, but most often we meet people who are worth remembering. A few weeks ago up near Jordan, Montana, that's somewhere in the middle of the state, I met an individual who will stand out in my memory. He let me ride one of his horses and I didn't fall off. He is a barrel-chested, banty-legged cowboy whose front tooth is missing and he isn't at all concerned about replacing it. His name is Dick Chisholm. Anyway, his cattle were starving and he was going to have to sell them, but being Dick Chisholm, he couldn't do that. So here's how the story goes. There used to be longer cattle drives, but that was a long time ago when there were cattle rustlers and Indians to worry about, when they didn't have to worry about horseless carriages driving through the herd. But then, of course, the herd wasn't on a state highway. You see, these black baldy cattle belong to Dick Chisholm, and you'd have to get to know Dick Chisholm. He's a cowboy. These cattle are his pride and joy, his own special breed. And when the drought came, along with the hoppers, that's grasshoppers, and ruined all the feed, Dick Chisholm decided to go on a cattle drive along state highways where the government grass is tall and free. He's been doing it for over 200 miles. Some may say he's crazy, but he's not.
Hey, let's go! I imagine there have been a few, if you've gone through towns, it'd be quite a strange sight to wake up in the morning, look out your bedroom or kitchen window and see this
see what's cattle going through.
Staring you in the face.
We had one person said she was listening to TV, and she says, I wonder how come they've got two programs on. I can hear somebody talking, I can also hear cows bellowing.
Looks like you got a pretty good crew of young men here helping you out.
You know, yeah, I've got, I think, one of the outstanding crews of conscientious boys. Everybody says this youth is not dependable, but when they'll put in 7 days a week and holidays and Sundays and everything, I can't see anything wrong with the dependability of our youth.
You've got about the longest pasture in the world here.
Well, I figure I've got one of the biggest ranches there is in the state of Montana. It's 400 miles around it.
How many miles a day do you average?
3 miles.
You don't hurry none too much, do you?
Well, we're not really showing these cattle scenery. We're trying to show them grass.
At the end of the day, the cattle are put to bed in a makeshift corral. It's almost dark by this time, and the next day arrives early, 7 days a week. It's not a very exciting life for the young cowhands, but then how many young men get to go on a cattle drive? What do you do at night for entertainment?
Well, the boys go to the local towns, and I think the entertainment is sufficient for putting any young boy of that age.
Are the cows getting fatter?
I think the cattle have gained at least 1 pound a day.
That's almost better than home, isn't it?
Well, at home they was losing 5 pounds a day. I would judge her maybe even more. If they would have had to stay at home, they wouldn't have survived. They would have had to went to town to market.
A lot of our neighbors have had to sell out and go to market.
Is that right? How have people treated you along the way?
Well, this has been most of the most wonderful trip that I have ever taken. We've had people come for miles to see us, and everyone along the way has been more than cooperative in every way, offering water and places to stay and anything that a person would need on the trail.
He doesn't like to talk about it, but one lady got so mad at Cheesham's cattle eating government grass, she started throwing rocks. But that was unusual. He has made more friends along the trail than you can shake a stick at. He's also given people something to talk about and remember.
We're about 10 miles out of town, up on the Porcupine Creek. And us cowboys, there were 3 of us, Jimmy, Lou, and myself. We'd gotten pretty good at the rhythm of life on the trail. One guy would have his turn at the water truck and moving the fence so the cattle had a place to go 3 miles on up the road. And the other 2 would keep the cattle basically off of the hard spot in the middle of the long highway. We had black snake whips, and we got good at taking the heads off of sunflowers. And it was along in here, late one evening about sunset. We had just gotten the cattle penned. Horses were still saddled. A car shows up with a couple of reporters from the Billings Gazette newspaper, biggest newspaper in the state of Montana. And I was horseback. We had this big, ugly black horse with a shaggy mane and tail. He was dumber than a box of rocks, but he had one trick. And if you pop the reins real fast, pop, 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 then he would back up and rear up and paw the air. Of course, being the show-off that I am, there's the camera. Pop, pop, pop. He backs up, rears up, paws the air, and I cracked my whip. Crack. And the photographer caught it on the camera. Snap. So this was on a Friday. And Sunday morning came out in the Billings Gazette. Front page, not half page, not quarter page, full page shot. Montana cowboy calling weather out, riding on the Cheesam Trail. That story went out statewide, and of course my supervisors at the college farm, they saw it. A couple of days later, my mother gets a notice in the mail to me from them saying, if you are well enough to do that, you would be well enough to come back to work. Fair enough. But what they didn't see was on the offside from the camera was my casted up foot tied to the saddle horn. My dreams of a college education and all future plans disappeared into the sunset. And I became a saddle bum. And for the next 3 months plus, we trailed these cattle out into the hard pan of central Montana on the north side of the Yellowstone River.